All right, welcome back. I want to discuss some of California's physiographic regions. This is the second part for Chapter 1. Before we get into the different regions, I want to introduce these two terms, cismontane versus transmontane. And this has to do with, cismontane means sort of this side of the mountains, where transmontane is more that other side of the mountains. So generally speaking, we have kind of two parts of California. We have this coastal part, that's cismontane. This is the wetter side along the Pacific Ocean. But then we have also isolated in the valley and in the deserts, we have what are called transmontane regions. These are the drier areas that are more isolated from the influence of the Pacific Ocean. So for example, starting in the north, we have the Klamath Mountains. So do you think those are cismontane or transmontane? So very wet region here near the ocean, clearly what we call cismontane. Or the Cascade Range, maybe a little more transmontane. And its climate is different. It's a bit drier. Cascade region is drier than the Klamath. And the Modoc Plateau over here is even drier still. It is definitely in what we call the transmontane zone. There's less forest in the Modoc Plateau. It's fairly flat, but very isolated. So grazing is probably the main economic activity, or is the main economic activity in the Modoc Plateau. Down here, we have the Sierra Nevada, and where we have the highest elevation in the United States with Mount McKinley, which is at about 14,000 feet. One thing about the Sierra Nevada is that it is very gentle, has a much more gentle slope on the west and a much more steep slope on the east. It's what's called a tilt block, which we will be talking about next week. We'll kind of get into more detail on how the Sierra is formed. Back in here, we have the Basin and Range area, or what we call the Trans-Sierra, the other side of the Sierra. Definitely a transmontane region. And it's so dry because of what's called a rain shadow effect, that as water moves, as air moves from the Pacific Ocean, the moisture is blocked by the Sierra Nevada and doesn't reach this Basin and Range area. One unique kind of life form in this area are what are called bristlecone pines. We're going to talk more about them and some of the other unique vegetation in California. These are the oldest living things on Earth. Just to give you a little more context from this map, this Basin and Range actually extends well into Nevada, Utah, and other parts of the interior West. So that a little bit of that spills over into California. In Southern California, we have the transmontane, the kind of the drier part, including the Mojave and the Colorado Desert. Sometimes these are called the high desert in the Mojave because generally it's a little bit higher elevation, where the Colorado tends to be at lower elevation. In the Mojave, this is if you've driven to Las Vegas, that you've driven through the Mojave where you see things like Joshua trees. And the Colorado Desert has a bit different vegetation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in detail as we get into those topics. The cismontane part over here by the ocean, we have the Peninsular Ranges in the area of San Diego, and we have the Transverse Ranges. Los Angeles is kind of right in the middle of the Transverse and Peninsular Ranges. One thing unique about the Transverse Ranges is that they're what we call a pivot point. They're where the area where around 5 different physical regions come together. We also have the various coast ranges. We can divide them into northern, wetter coast ranges and a bit drier, what we call Mediterranean southern coast ranges, because it has a sort of a drier summer climate. And then also the Great Central Valley. This is an area that's been highly transformed by agriculture, and that's a topic we will talk about as well. So it used to look like this 100 years ago, and that same area looks like this to the right today. All right, and that concludes just a brief overview of some of the regions, and we will add more material as we go. One thing I want to highlight is we will have a map quiz on these regions of California. So more on that later.